Imagine walking into a place only to be ignored, humiliated, and treated like you're worthless. Now think about what would happen if this underestimated person was actually someone with enough power to completely change the course of the situation. Life has mysterious ways of teaching lessons, and when arrogance becomes someone's only language, fate always finds a way to respond in kind. Today's story is a true example of poetic justice, one of those twists that make anyone think twice before judging someone based on their appearance. What began as a simple service at a luxury restaurant quickly turned into a spectacle of arrogance, disdain, and, in the end, irreversible regret. What no one expected was that that client, treated like any other, had the power to change the game in an impact way. Have you ever seen someone belittled and then come back in an epic way? Have you ever felt the satisfaction of seeing justice being done in front of everyone? This story will leave you speechless. The waiter, used to measuring people by what they wear, by what they look like, had no idea who he was about to insult. To him, that man in simple clothes was just another man who didn't deserve his attention, but he was about to learn the worst way that respect is not measured by visible money but by essence. Every word spoken with disdain, every gesture of arrogance, and every look of contempt built a perfect scenario for unexpected revenge. The entire restaurant watched, without imagining that that night would become unforgettable. And when the tables turned, everyone's reaction was the same: absolute shock. What happened after this public humiliation took everyone by surprise. The waiter, who until minutes ago was in control, realized he had made a mistake that would change his life forever. Disapproving looks turned to him. The truth came out, and at that moment he realized he had lost everything. But did he have time to redeem himself? Did you manage to fix the error before it was too late? Get ready, because the twist that comes next will leave you with your jaw dropped. The restaurant was packed, the shine of the crystal glasses reflected on the huge golden lamps, while customers, dressed in designer clothes, chatted among themselves, savoring refined dishes. It was an environment where only the most privileged felt at ease, a space reserved for those who could flaunt their status. The main waiter, a man with a haughty posture and sharp eyes, knew this game well. For him, appearance said everything about a person, and he was about to prove just that. The door opened discreetly, and a man entered without fanfare. Wearing a baggy sweatshirt, regular jeans, and a flat-brimmed cap, he looked out of place in the upscale setting. His walk was calm, unhurried, like someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, but he only had to take a few steps to realize that he had attracted attention. Crossed glances emerged from different tables. Discreet whispers began to circulate among some customers. Who was that guy? What was he doing there? The waiter observed him from afar, and in a few seconds he had already made his judgment. With an impatient sigh, he straightened his apron, raised his head, and walked towards the new customer. When he finally stopped in front of you, he crossed his arms and gave you a sarcastic smile. "Are you sure this restaurant is for you?" The question cut through the air like a blade. The tone of voice left no doubt. This was not a simple doubt, but rather a provocation. The waiter didn't ask out of politeness. He asked because he wanted the man to understand that he was not welcome there. For a brief moment, the restaurant was silent. Some people held back their laughter, waiting to see how this would play out. Others simply ignored it, accustomed to this type of scene. But the man in the sweatshirt showed no reaction. He just slowly raised his eyes and looked straight at the waiter. "I want a table for one." The answer was said calmly, without hesitation. But instead of relenting, the waiter snorted and shook his head, as if he were dealing with someone who simply didn't get the message. "Look, my dear, this restaurant is an exclusive place. We serve refined dishes, imported wines, desserts designed by renowned chefs. Not just anyone can sit here and make a wish. He emphasized the words "not just anyone," as if he wanted to make sure the other would understand. But still, the man did not react as expected. He just smiled as if he had been through this before, as if that situation for him was nothing new. "Excellent. So bring me the menu." The waiter rolled his eyes, frustrated. He didn't want to serve that customer. I didn't want someone like him to be there, occupying a space where rich and influential people would normally be. But on the other hand, he also knew that he couldn't just kick him out without a real reason. With an exaggerated sigh, he picked up a menu and threw it onto the table with a little more force than necessary. Then he crossed his arms again, waiting to see what the order would be. The man calmly leafed through the menu, scanning the luxurious dishes and sophisticated combinations. Then, without rushing, he pointed to one of the most expensive items in the house. "I want this one. And also bring me a bottle of that special house wine." The waiter raised his eyebrows. He didn't expect that. It was common for customers who couldn't pay to try to order something cheap to avoid attracting attention. But this man, who clearly didn't fit the restaurant's standards, was ordering one of the most exclusive dishes on the menu. He chuckled and leaned forward a little. "He is sure. Because honestly, this dish is not cheap at all." The tone was mocking. The waiter wanted to provoke a reaction. I wanted that man to hesitate, to show some sign of discomfort. But to his surprise, the answer came in the same calm tone as before. "Yes. You can write it down." The waiter narrowed his eyes, assessing the customer for a moment. So he decided to go further. "And how do you intend to pay?" The question was said casually, but deep down it carried a silent venom. The waiter wanted to expose that man in front of everyone. I wanted to see him get embarrassed, maybe desperately look for his wallet, or come up with some excuse to get out of there before embarrassing himself, but none of that happened. The man just took a card from his pocket and placed it on the table. It was a black card, one of those that few people in the world had. The type of card that has no limit. The waiter looked at the card, then at the man. Something inside him told him he had made a mistake, but his pride was too great to admit it. He took the menu back, forcing a wry smile. "All good. I will arrange your order." He turned and started walking towards the kitchen, but what he still didn't know was that that night was just beginning. Now tell me one thing. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a situation like this? Where has someone been underestimated, treated with disdain, only to prove that appearances can be deceiving? Tell me here in the comments. I read them all. I want to know your opinion on this story, and if you think the waiter can still redeem himself after what he did. Respect should not be a choice based on someone's appearance or status. And this story proves exactly that. What happened next was a true lesson in justice, a moment in which the tables turned in an impressive way. And if you think you've already seen incredible comebacks, just wait until you find out what this waiter faced next. So leave a like on this video if you believe that the world goes around and that justice always finds its way. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell because there are lots of stories like this coming, and you won't want to miss any details. Now hold on tight because the next part of this story is simply unbelievable. When the truth came out, the waiter realized there was no turning back. Silence took over the restaurant, eyes turned to him, and at that moment he understood that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Want to know what happened? So stay with us, because the worst was yet to come. Snoop Dogg just wanted a quiet meal. After a long schedule of appointments, all he wanted was to sit down, place his order, and enjoy a good dinner without attracting attention. But it seemed the simple fact that he was there, dressed casually, bothered him. The restaurant was filled with customers sporting expensive clothes, shiny jewelry, and sophisticated perfumes. The environment was luxurious, and everyone seemed to fit perfectly into that setting, except him. The waiter, who had already made his contempt clear, continued to ignore Snoop Dogg, walking from one side to the other, serving other tables, always with a smile on his face for the customers he considered worthy of his attention. But for Snoop Dogg, he wouldn't even spare a glance. The singer realized the situation, but maintained his calm posture. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone. The minutes passed, and the waiter's indifference became increasingly evident. The surrounding customers noticed what was happening. Some exchanged glances and discreet smiles, as if they agreed with the employee's attitude. Others just watched the scene without intervening. Deep down, it was as if everyone was waiting to see how far this would go. Would that man in the sweatshirt get up and leave humiliated? Would he insist? But Snoop Dogg didn't leave. Instead, he stood there, patient, until he finally raised his hand to summon the waiter. The employee approached with a bored expression, as if he was doing a huge favor. "Right?" he asked, making no effort to sound polite. Snoop Dogg looked at the menu and without hesitation pointed to one of the most expensive dishes in the house. "I want this one," he said as calmly as always. "And also, bring me a bottle of the best house wine." The waiter's reaction was immediate. He chuckled softly, shaking his head mockingly. "He is sure. This dish isn't exactly cheap," he emphasized, looking Snoop Dogg up and down. The entire restaurant seemed attentive. Some people held back their laughter, while others waited for the answer. But Snoop Dogg just smiled, as if he already knew exactly how this situation would end. "Yes, I'm sure," he replied, without showing any discomfort. The waiter crossed his arms and continued staring at the customer for a few seconds. He wanted to see any reaction, any sign of discomfort that indicated this guy didn't have the money to pay. But Snoop Dogg remained impassive. "Very good," said the waiter, taking the menu back. "And how do you intend to pay?" The question was loaded with malice. The tone of voice made it clear that he wasn't asking out of protocol, but rather to expose the client in front of everyone. He expected the man to be embarrassed, perhaps to say something like, "I'll pay by debit," or "Can I split it into installments?" But to his surprise, Snoop Dogg simply took a black card from his pocket and placed it on the table. The waiter's eyes widened for a brief moment. This was no ordinary card. It was an unlimited card, one of those that only the ultra-rich have. But since he had already gone too far, he couldn't just change his stance from one moment to the next. He took the card with an unreadable expression and walked away, heading towards the cashier. It was at that moment that something began to change in the environment. Some customers whispered, trying to understand who this man was who, until a few minutes ago, was treated with disdain. Others took out their cell phones and began searching discreetly, and that's when everything fell apart for the waiter. A woman at another table widened her eyes and whispered something to her companion. Soon, information began to spread among customers. That man was not a stranger. That man was Snoop Dogg. The tension in the restaurant grew. The waiter, still unaware, returned to the table and placed the payment machine in front of Snoop Dogg. He still wanted to see the card, declined, wanted to find some reason to reinforce his belief that the man didn't belong there. But when Snoop Dogg took the card back and held the machine to enter his PIN, one of the customers stood up and said loudly, "Do you know who he is?" The waiter frowned. "What, do you know who this guy is?" insisted the customer, now drawing everyone's attention. The waiter looked at Snoop Dogg, confused. He felt a chill run down his spine, but tried to maintain his composure. "I don't know." The customer laughed in disbelief. "My friend, you just treated Snoop Dogg like anyone else." Silence took over the environment. The waiter blinked a few times in disbelief. He looked back at Snoop Dogg, who now just stared at him with a smirk. At this moment, the faces of the other customers began to light up. One after another, people started to recognize the singer. Some took out their cell phones to take photos, others began to murmur in surprise. The restaurant manager, who until then was not paying attention to the situation, hurried to see what was happening. The waiter felt his stomach drop. He had made a very serious mistake. He didn't just treat any customer badly, he treated one of music's greatest living legends badly. He acted arrogantly, trying to humiliate someone who could actually buy the entire restaurant without blinking. Now tell me something. Have you ever seen a situation like this, where someone belittled a person without knowing who they really were? How do you think this waiter should react now? Comment below. I read all the comments. And if you think this story is already impressive, wait until you see what happened next. When the manager realized the size of the problem, he tried to reverse the situation. But it was too late. What came next was a twist no one expected. If you want to know how this story ends, keep following, because the ending will leave you with your mouth open. The waiter couldn't hide his contempt. He looked at Snoop Dogg as if he were facing someone who didn't even deserve to be there. The arrogant smile on his face showed that, for him, this was all a joke. "So you want this dish?" he repeated, still holding the menu. "You know, we have some more affordable options, something that may be more within your budget." He emphasized the more accessible words as if he were giving generous advice, but his tone was full of malice. Snoop Dogg remained calm, unfazed, but in the restaurant, some customers were already starting to laugh softly. The waiter understood and appreciated the attention. He wanted to turn that moment into a kind of spectacle. He wanted everyone to see how outside the norm that client was. "But of course, if you want to insist on this request, that's fine," he continued, pretending to be sympathetic. "I just don't want you to go through any awkward situations later." The discreet laughter grew a little more. For the waiter, this was confirmation that he was in control. That's how he felt in his position, in charge, deciding who was important and who didn't even deserve to be well attended to. But he had no idea he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Snoop Dogg crossed his arms and smirked. He had been through similar situations before. He knew exactly what happened when someone judged him based on his appearance, and he knew even more the impact that the truth would have when it finally came to light. "I want that dish," he repeated, his voice calm but firm. The waiter rolled his eyes, but before walking away he made a point of making one more sarcastic comment. "As you prefer. I just hope payment isn't a problem." That time, some people laughed loudly, as if the humiliation had reached a new level. The waiter walked away with a look of victory, heading towards the kitchen. But he didn't realize that at that very moment, the laughter was about to turn into murmurs of surprise. A woman sitting at a nearby table looked closely at Snoop Dogg and frowned. Something about him seemed familiar. She cocked her head to the side, trying to remember where she knew him. Then he whispered something to the man next to him, who immediately took out his cell phone and started searching for something on Google. Seconds later, his eyes widened. "Wait a minute," he muttered, looking at Snoop Dogg again. The reaction was contagious. Other people around, curious about the conversation, did the same. Cell phones began to be unlocked, quick searches were carried out, and one by one, customers began to realize what was happening. "It can't be. My God, it's him." The buzz grew, and the waiter, still at the counter, began to notice that something was different. He frowned and looked around, noticing that people were now whispering and looking directly at his table. He didn't understand right away, but when he picked up the controller with Snoop Dogg's request and came back, he felt a strange shiver. When he arrived at the table, he noticed that the customers around him had different expressions. The laughter disappeared. Some looked shocked, others even a little uncomfortable. The waiter frowned, not understanding. "Any problems?" he asked. The man who had done the Google search looked directly at him and let out an incredulous laugh. "You don't know, right?" "Know what?" the waiter replied, still confused. The customer shook his head, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then he discreetly pointed to Snoop Dogg and said, "You just trashed Snoop Dogg." Silence took over the restaurant. The waiter blinked a few times, as if his brain was slowly processing the information. His face lost color, and his body became rigid. He looked back at Snoop Dogg, now seeing him in a new light. The features, the calm manner, the confident look. How did he not notice it before? Reality hit like a punch in the stomach. He hadn't just treated any customer badly. He hadn't made jokes just to entertain himself and others. He had humiliated a living legend. The air in the restaurant became heavy. The waiter felt his body heat up, and sweat began to form on the back of his neck. His eyes widened, and he tried to swallow hard, but his mouth was completely dry. "Yes, sir." He tried to say something, but the words failed him. It was at that moment that the manager appeared. He had been warned by one of the customers that something was happening, and when he arrived, he saw the waiter's terrified expression and people around him mumbling about Snoop Dogg's name. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking from the employee to Snoop Dogg, then to the surrounding customers. The man who had done the research was quick to respond. "Your waiter humiliated one of the biggest names in music by thinking he was an ordinary person." The manager immediately turned pale. He didn't need to hear anything else. His sharp gaze fell on the waiter, who now looked like he was about to melt with embarrassment. Snoop Dogg, however, remained calm. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to make a fuss. The simple fact of who he was said it all. "Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen a similar situation where someone was treated with disrespect and then turned it around? What do you think should happen to this waiter now? Comment below. I read all the comments, and if you think this story is already surreal, wait until you see what happened next." When the manager tried to resolve the situation, he had no idea that the turnaround was far from over. What happened next was simply unbelievable. Get ready, because the most intense part of this story is coming. The silence in the restaurant seemed to grow by the second. The revelation that that client, humiliated and treated with contempt, was none other than Snoop Dogg, had hit everyone like an electric shock. But the waiter, still blinded by his own ego, refused to accept what was in front of him. His face, once plastered with a sarcastic smile, was now contorted into an expression of pure discomfort. The manager's look was a mixture of fury and despair as the customers murmured among themselves, realizing the gravity of the situation. But even faced with the truth, the waiter tried to maintain control of the narrative. As if he could still reverse that, he let out a nervous laugh and crossed his arms, pretending not to be shaken. "This isn't fast food." "Maybe you should look for another place," he said, in a last-ditch effort to assert his dominance over the situation. The sentence fell like a bomb in the environment. A mix of shock and disbelief took over the restaurant. Some customers widened their eyes, others sighed softly, as if they couldn't believe what they had just heard. The manager remained completely still, without reacting. Snoop Dogg, however, didn't show any anger. He just kept that smile on his face, serene but full of meaning. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to confront the waiter. That was the kind of moment where silence spoke loudest. But, unlike what the waiter expected, no one laughed this time. The audience that had previously enjoyed the spectacle now felt a heaviness in the air. Some looked uncomfortable, others just watched with bated breath. Everyone knew that the waiter had crossed a line that could no longer be undone. It was then that in a slow and calculated movement, Snoop Dogg got up from the table. His gaze roamed the restaurant, passing through the faces of the customers, the manager, until returning to the waiter, who was now sweating coldly. "So that's it?" he said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made even the most distant customers pay attention. The waiter tried to maintain his pose, but his body gave away the tension. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the manager took action. "Sir, please, this was all a big misunderstanding," he said, trying desperately to save the situation. His face was pale, and the way he gestured made it clear that he was completely terrified. He looked at the waiter, as if expecting him to do something to remedy the situation. But the waiter, stubborn and still refusing to admit his mistake, just shrugged his shoulders. "I'm just following the house rules," he murmured. But now his voice no longer carried the same confidence as before. The manager took a deep breath, realizing that he would have to resolve this alone. "Mr. Dogg, please allow me to correct this error. Your meal will be on us. Sit down, we'll bring you what you ordered right away." Customers watched the scene in absolute silence. Some were already recording discreetly with their cell phones. What had started as an ordinary night turned into a live spectacle of poetic justice. Snoop Dogg looked at the manager, then at the waiter. He could just accept the apology and move on with his night. I could let it go. But he knew that some lessons are only learned when they are felt. "I appreciate the offer," he said, crossing his arms. "But I'm not interested in the food. I'm more interested in how you treat people." The weight of those words made the manager swallow hard. The waiter, on the other hand, began to understand that there was no longer any escape. His face was now red, not from anger, but from embarrassment. He wanted to respond, he wanted to find a justification, but no words seemed appropriate at that moment. The silence lasted until one of the closest customers finally decided to speak out. "I think it's clear who should get out of here," said a man sitting a few tables away. The comment was followed by murmurs of agreement. Some people shook their heads, others just waited to see what would happen. The manager, realizing he could no longer delay the inevitable, slowly turned to the waiter. His face was now serious, his posture rigid. "I need you to accompany me to the office," he said, his voice cold and direct. The waiter looked at him, then at the customers, and finally at Snoop Dogg. His mouth opened slightly as if he were going to protest, but he knew there was no way out. With one last heavy sigh, he took off his apron and threw it on the table. Without saying anything else, he turned and started walking towards the back of the restaurant. The restaurant remained silent until he completely disappeared. Then, as if an invisible tension had been broken, the patrons began talking again, some still in shock, others commenting among themselves on what they had just witnessed. Snoop Dogg, still standing, just watched. He didn't look pleased, nor did he seem vengeful. He just wanted the message to be understood. "And now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of the waiter's attitude? Did he deserve what happened? Comment below. I want to know if you've ever seen something similar, or if you've ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you like that. And if you think this story had enough emotion, just wait until you find out what happened then, because this twist isn't over yet. And there's a detail at the end that made this story even more unbelievable. Hold on tight, because what comes next will leave you with your mouth open." The restaurant, which minutes before had been surrounded by whispers and looks of disdain, was now plunged into a tense silence. The waiter, who until then seemed so sure of himself, with that superior air of someone who believed he was in control of the situation, began to realize that something was wrong. His face, previously plastered with an arrogant smile, now displayed a confused and apprehensive expression. He felt the eyes on him, but this time they weren't looks of approval. They were looks of judgment, of disbelief, as if he had suddenly become the center of a spectacle he never wanted to be part of. It was then that the first whisper came. "Hey, that's Snoop Dogg." The comment came from a nearby table, but the reaction was immediate. Other people, previously busy with their own dishes and conversations, stopped to look. A woman took out her cell phone and quickly typed something into Google. Within seconds, the murmurs multiplied, growing like a domino effect. "My God, it's him. What do you mean the waiter spoke to Snoop Dogg like that? This will cause problems." The expressions in the restaurant completely changed. The contempt that previously hung over Snoop Dogg now turned towards the waiter. His arrogance was dissolving in the face of the reality that had just come to light. The confident stance gave way to an uncomfortable stiffness. He looked around, realizing something was out of his control. And then, As if fate was just waiting for the right moment to act, the kitchen door opened wide and out came the restaurant manager, a man with an impeccable suit and a sharp gaze. He walked hurriedly, holding a napkin in his hand, and his forehead was sweaty. As soon as he saw the waiter, his expression changed. He realized that the entire restaurant was looking in the same direction and that something very wrong had happened. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice thick with urgency. The customers looked at each other. No one wanted to be the first to speak, but it wasn't long before an older man, sitting near the entrance, took the initiative. "What is happening? Your waiter just treated one of the greatest artists in the world, as if he were just anyone." The manager frowned, not immediately understanding. But it was enough to follow the crowd's gaze to realize that, in the center of it all, sitting calmly at the table, was Snoop Dogg. The impact was immediate. The manager lost the color in his face. His eyes blinked a few times, as if he needed a moment to process what he was seeing. The tension in his body was visible, and when he turned to face the waiter, the look he gave him was enough to make it clear that the waiter had made a very serious mistake. The waiter, now completely pale, tried to explain himself. I didn't know." But his voice came out weak, without conviction. He looked around, looking for support, but realized that no one else was on his side. Customers who had previously laughed at his jokes now watched him disapprovingly. He tried to swallow hard, but it felt like his throat was blocked. The manager wasted no time. "Did you treat Mr. Dogg badly?" The waiter hesitated. He knew that any answer he gave would only make his situation worse. "But at the same time, I knew I couldn't just deny what everyone had just witnessed. I didn't realize it was him." The manager took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but the tension on his face was evident. He turned to Snoop Dogg, trying to fix the disaster. "Mr. Dogg, please accept our apologies for the terrible misunderstanding. This does not represent the quality of our service." Snoop Dogg remained silent for a few seconds, observing the scene. He didn't seem furious, didn't seem ready to shout or cause a scene, but that was exactly what made the situation even more uncomfortable for the waiter. The rapper's tranquility contrasted with the visible despair of the employee, who was now sweating and moving his hands non-stop. "I appreciate the apology," Snoop Dogg finally said. His voice was calm, but each word carried immense weight. "But tell me one thing. If I weren't who I am, would this treatment have been different?" The restaurant was completely silent. The manager glanced at the waiter, who now could no longer hold his gaze. He knew the real answer was no. If Snoop Dogg wasn't famous, he probably would have been kicked out of the restaurant without anyone thinking twice. The weight of that truth hung in the air. The waiter's discomfort grew by the second, and the manager realized he needed to act quickly. "Mr. Dogg, dinner will be entirely on the house," he announced, desperately trying to defuse the situation. "We want to right this wrong and ensure you get the experience you deserve." But Snoop Dogg just shook his head. "It's not about the food, it's about respect." The impact of that response was immediate. Some people nodded discreetly, while others looked at the waiter, waiting to see how he would react, but he had nothing more to say. His pride, his arrogance, everything had crumbled before that simple yet powerful phrase. The manager realized he needed to make a decision. He turned to the waiter again, and this time his voice no longer carried any trace of patience. "Meet me at the office. Now." The waiter hesitated, as if he wanted to argue, but he knew that anything he said at that moment would only make his situation worse. He lowered his head, feeling the weight of his own mistake, and began to walk slowly towards the inside of the restaurant. "And now, tell me, what do you think should happen to this waiter? Do you believe the manager should fire him or give him a second chance? Comment below. I want to know your opinion, but if you think this story is over, just wait until you find out what happened next. Because this twist isn't over yet, and what happened in the next few minutes took everyone by surprise. Hold on tight because the most unbelievable part of this story is coming. The atmosphere in the restaurant was charged with tension. The manager, desperately trying to save the establishment's reputation, was still trying to negotiate a solution, but it was already clear that he had completely lost control of the situation. The people around them no longer spoke in discreet whispers. Now the comments were audible, full of indignation and shock. The waiter, who minutes before felt at the height of his arrogance, was now pale, completely motionless, unable to react. Snoop Dogg, still sitting, maintained a calm posture. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to demand anything. His silence was more powerful than any speech, and it made the manager and waiter's discomfort grow by the second. But then, with a slight movement, he picked up his cell phone and began sliding his fingers across the screen. The manager swallowed. "Mr. Dogg, please, I'm really sorry about what happened here today. This attitude does not reflect the values of our restaurant." The waiter looked away. He knew there was no way out for him anymore. The humiliation was already done, and now it was too late for any regret. But he still had no idea how much trouble he was about to get into. Snoop Dogg put his cell phone to his ear. The entire restaurant watched in absolute silence. The manager began to sweat, looking around as if trying to anticipate what was about to happen. The waiter, who was already uncomfortable, began to feel panic spread throughout his body. "Yes, it's me," Snoop Dogg said on the phone. "I'm at the restaurant now." The manager stood completely still. The waiter frowned, trying to understand who he was talking to. "That's right," continued Snoop Dogg. "Can you check the reports? I want to know exactly who's in charge tonight." The manager, already feeling his heart racing, opened his mouth to try to speak, but Snoop Dogg raised one of his hands, indicating that he was still on the phone and that no one should interrupt him. The seconds seemed to drag by. The waiter couldn't breathe properly. He looked around, seeing all the customers' faces fixated on him and Snoop Dogg. What was happening? What kind of call was that? And then, after a few moments, Snoop Dogg let out a low laugh. I understood. "Well, then we have a problem here." The manager could no longer hide his concern. He looked at the waiter, who now looked like he was about to break down. But before either of them could say anything, Snoop Dogg finally ended the call, placed his cell phone on the table, and looked directly at his manager. "Do you know who one of the partners of this restaurant is?" The manager blinked quickly. He was trying to put the pieces together, trying to understand where this was going. "Well, the owners are a group of investors," he began to say, his voice shaking slightly. Snoop Dogg shook his head, interrupting the manager. "Exactly, and I am one of them." The shock was instantaneous. The manager turned completely pale. His breath caught in his chest, and his legs almost gave out. The waiter, who was already pale before, now looked like a ghost. His eyes widened, and he was speechless, unable to process what he had just heard. The surrounding customers exchanged surprised looks. Some already suspected that Snoop Dogg had some connection to the restaurant, but no one imagined that he was one of the partners. This meant that he had real power over that place, that his word carried weight, and that any decision he made at that moment would be final. The manager tried to compose himself. "As Mr. Dogg, I didn't know," but Snoop Dogg just looked straight at him with a serious but non-angry look. He didn't need to get excited. The simple revelation had been enough to completely transform the situation. And then he looked away at the waiter. The man was shaking, his face was sweating, his chest was rising and falling rapidly, as if he was struggling to breathe. He tried to say something, tried to find a justification, but he knew that nothing he said would change what had happened. It was the manager who broke the silence. "Mr. Dogg, please, can I fix this? I guarantee this type of behavior will not be tolerated." But Snoop Dogg just shook his head. "What I want to know is, if this happened to me, how many other people have experienced this?" The question caught the manager off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, but realized that anything he said would only confirm the worst truth. That waiter had probably treated several other customers with the same disrespect, but they weren't famous enough for anyone to care. The silence that followed was one of the heaviest moments of the night. The manager knew he needed to take action. He looked at the waiter, and his face became serious. "You're fired," he said bluntly. The waiter froze. "What? You're fired," the manager repeated more firmly this time. "Get your things and leave immediately." The man looked around as if waiting for someone to intervene, but no one moved. None of the customers showed any empathy for him. What previously seemed like an audience that laughed along with his jokes now looked at him with contempt, as if he were the real stranger in that environment. His body was locked up. He wanted to scream, he wanted to protest, but he knew there was no point anymore. Slowly, he untied his apron, took it off, and threw it onto the table, his last show of resistance. But no one cared anymore. The manager just watched as he turned his back and walked towards the exit, his posture now slumped, defeated. The customers remained silent until the door closed behind him, and then, as if a weight had been lifted from the room, some people began to murmur, others shook their heads, and some even applauded discreetly. Snoop Dogg remained calm. He didn't celebrate, he didn't smile. He just observed the scene, as if he wanted to make sure that it really happened. "And now I want to hear from you. Do you think the dismissal was enough, or did he deserve a greater punishment? Comment below. Also tell me if you've ever witnessed something similar, if you've ever seen someone humiliated just because of their appearance and then turning things around. But if you think this story is over, you are wrong, because what happened next took everyone by surprise. This twist still has one last detail that will make this story even more unbelievable. Hold on tight, because the final part will shock you. The restaurant was still in shock. The murmurs, the looks exchanged, the weight of the situation. Everything indicated that that moment would be marked forever. The waiter was no longer there. The door he exited through was still swaying slightly, a reminder that arrogance and disrespect always find their price. Snoop Dogg remained silent for a few seconds, observing the environment around him. There was no pleasure in his expression, no air of revenge. Just a serene calm, as if he already knew from the beginning that destiny would take care of teaching the necessary lesson. The manager, still nervous, tried to regain control of the situation. He knew that a mistake like that could be costly to the restaurant's reputation. If that were to be leaked to the media, the name of the establishment would be tarnished. And considering how many people were discreetly filming with their cell phones, it was almost certain that before long the entire world would know what happened that night. With a forced smile, he turned back to Snoop Dogg. "Mr. Dogg, please allow us to make up for this error. Your meal will be on the house, and we guarantee that something like this will never happen again." Snoop Dogg slowly looked away from his manager and shook his head slightly. "It's not about the food," he said, his voice calm but heavy. The manager felt a lump tighten in his throat. What could I say in the face of such an obvious truth? He knew there was no point in offering expensive dishes or luxurious wine to try to make amends for what had happened. The problem there was not financial. The problem was moral. Snoop Dogg rested his elbows on the table and intertwined his fingers. His posture was relaxed, but his presence dominated the room. "The problem is that you judge people before you even know who they are," he continued. "What if I wasn't Snoop Dogg? If I were just an ordinary guy, someone who came here for dinner after a hard day? He would have treated me the same way, and no one would have done anything." The restaurant was silent. Customers who previously watched everything from a box were now cowering in their seats, feeling the impact of the words. The manager tried to argue, but Snoop Dogg raised his hand, asking for silence. "I don't want a free dinner. I don't want empty excuses." I want you to understand that respect should not be given because of status or money. Respect should be the minimum. The words echoed through the restaurant. It wasn't an impassioned speech. It wasn't a moment of humiliation. It was a lesson. One that, at that moment, made everyone there reflect on their own attitudes. The manager nodded, speechless. He knew there was no justification, no excuse that could be used to erase that moment. He just hung his head, embarrassed. Snoop Dogg then stood up. He looked around, taking in the customers' faces. Some were visibly embarrassed, others seemed amazed. Many learned something that night. He took his card, put it in his pocket, and straightened his coat. Before leaving, he turned one last time and said, with a calm smile, "Respect people, not for their money, but because it is the right thing to do." With those words, he walked towards the exit. The restaurant was silent for a few seconds, until, little by little, some people started to clap. First timidly, then more intensely. The lesson had been taught. If you followed this story until the end, you may have already realized that respect is something you can't buy. It doesn't matter money, fame, or status. What really defines someone is how they treat others. And that was the big lesson of that night. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this twist? Do you believe the waiter learned his lesson, or did he need a bigger punishment? Comment below. I read all the comments, and if you agree that respect is worth more than luxury, write exactly that sentence in the comments so I know you got this far. If this story impacted you, leave a like, because it helps me continue bringing more content like this to you. And of course, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories full of justice, poetic revenge, and twists that will surprise you. Now don't go away. The next video is already appearing on the screen, and I'm sure you won't want to miss this other unbelievable story. Click there and come with me.